Thank you. And welcome. Welcome to all of you who are joining us today. I'm very excited about this event. It is the first in a year-long series of conversations on the effects of climate change in various policy arenas. This one happens to be national security, which is incredibly important. In the future, we're going to be looking at climate change in agriculture, climate change in manufacturing, all of the various policy areas that impact us here in Ohio and around the country. I should introduce myself for those of you who don't know. I'm Jane Harf. I am the Executive Director of Green Energy Ohio. And I'm going to start the conversation today with some questions for our guests. But at some point in the day, in the afternoon, we will be opening up for questions from the audience. I would encourage you to be thinking about what you would like to ask our guests and to submit them through the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Type them in at any time. We will try to get to as many as possible in the time that we have. So yes, type your questions in there. So thank you. I am going to start with introductions. Our distinguished guests, I want to say how pleased we are to have this group of individuals with us today. I'm going to start with Congresswoman Elaine Luria, and I'm going to read these so I don't leave any important details out. Congressman Luria represents Virginia's 2nd Congressional District. Prior to her election in 2018, she served 2 decades in the Navy, retiring at the rank of commander. Representative Luria served at sea on 6 ships as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, deployed to the Middle East and the Western Pacific, and culminated her Navy career by commanding a battle-ready unit of 400 sailors. In Congress, she serves on the House Armed Services Committee, where she is the committee's vice chair, the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, and the House Committee on Homeland Security. Representative Luria graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy and received a master's in engineering management from Old Dominion University. Dr. Robert McCollister was trained as a presenter for the Climate Reality Project in Chicago in 2013. And since then, he has given over 40 presentations to audiences across Ohio and in West Virginia. He earned his PhD in political science from The Ohio State University with a major in international relations and a concentration in national security policy studies, focusing on nuclear weapons and arms control. A resident of Ironton, Bob joined the Green Energy Ohio Board of Directors in 2020. Bob has also recorded one of his climate reality presentations on today's topic, and it will be posted on the GEO website. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Climate Reality Project is the program that former Vice President Al Gore started and now has many hundreds of thousands of trained presenters across the world, around the globe. Dr. Fred Schauer is an associate professor at the Air Force Institute of Technology, the Department of the Air Force's Graduate School of Engineering and Management. His research on energy, propulsion, and power has focused on novel cycles, including conventional, fueled, and bioalternative powered systems, ranging from the milliwatt to terawatt scale. Prior to joining the Air Force Institute of Technology, he worked with the Air Force Research Laboratory and its predecessor organizations at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton. So welcome all 3 of you. I don't know if anybody wants to say any initial words, but I can just start right away with a question. I think I'll do that. I'd like to begin the conversation with a question to Representative Luria. what do you see as the greatest threats to critical military infrastructure, both at home and abroad, as a result of climate change? It's a broad question. And our other panelists can, if I direct a question specifically to someone, our other panelists should feel free to join in as well. But I wanted to start with you.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for including me today. And it's great to be here with you, Bob and Fred, to discuss these issues related to energy. And, you know, as a member of the Armed Services Committee and representing a district in coastal Virginia, where we have 8 major military installations, climate change, I think, is really on the forefront of looking at our national security, the vulnerability of these installations. And here it has to do with sea level rise and recurrent flooding. We have seen huge impacts due to rising sea levels to all of our military installations around the area. Recent studies by DoD have put 3 of the most vulnerable top 10 in the country just in our region related to that sea level rise due to climate change. And, you know, on the Armed Services Committee, I've really worked to try to promote programs that will deal with the effects of climate change. Obviously, there's the other side of it, reversing climate change, cutting CO2 emissions, but there's a lot of infrastructure issues that I work very closely with, such as programs coordinating between DoD and the local communities outside the fence line relative to defense access roads, defense infrastructure projects that can help mitigate some of the vulnerabilities, access to our bases, ability of our forces to deploy related to climate change. But I'll give you an example here in our area, Norfolk Naval Shipyard. It's one of the 2 largest public shipyards that we have in the country. The dry docks that we're using at that shipyard date to immediately post World War I. So if you can imagine the change in sea level that we've had during that time frame and the vulnerability of, you know, those critical dry docks. It's really the only place on the East Coast where we can currently dry dock aircraft carriers and do critical maintenance. And, you know, we really, as part of our defense budget, need to make the infrastructure investments to be able to continue our operations in these regions that are so vulnerable to climate change. So that's kind of the direct impact and specifically on this region, but, you know, in other parts of the country, drought, wildfires, other different types of environmental factors that are results of climate change also put many of our military installations in very vulnerable positions. Tyndall Air Force Base, for example, the hurricane recently, have had to relocate multiple squadrons there. And, you know, one of those F-22 squadrons is actually coming here to Hampton, Virginia. And the cost to rebuild that infrastructure after, you know, major weather events or climate events is astronomical. So I think that, you know, putting the investment in up front is very important. Another thing as well is working very closely with the Army Corps of Engineers and understanding, you know, how they evaluate and assess these major infrastructure projects that are, you know, being evaluated, you know, for future construction relative to some of the effects of climate change. One of the technicalities that I found in the whole process is they actually do not consider federal property or the economic impact of federal property in their assessment process. So that is something that I'm working on through the National Defense Authorization Act and also the WRDA, which is the Water Resources Act, to, you know, have that included. If you look at a region such as ours, 42% of our economy is directly tied to Navy and the DoD. And if you're going to make these investments to protect our defense infrastructure, when the Army Corps, you know, evaluates the region, the Elizabeth River, which runs, you know, right through the middle of Norfolk, doesn't, you know, distinguish between private property and the naval station. I mean, we need to look holistically at those environmental impacts. And so those are some other things that I've also been working on relative to the impact on our military installations.
That's there. We all hear about sea level rise. And in fact, the Green Energy Ohio Climate Change Book Club just read a book called Rising and it talked about all of the various places, the land that is being lost throughout, particularly throughout the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast, but also the Pacific coast, which we don't think about as much. But it is definitely an issue, as you said, as is drought, wildfire potential. I know some of the Air Force bases in the Western US have faced issues with that. And, you know, I've also heard Bob talk about fuel convoys and sort of the threat to our troops abroad in terms of climate change and how we can make sure they are more secure. And I don't know if Bob, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, when I was at our training in Chicago in 2013, we had a speaker from the Truman National Security Project named Mike Breen, who was captain of the United States Army, and said one of the most dangerous things to do missions in Iraq was escorting fuel convoys. And you had these really long logistical lines that extended from the Gulf all the way up into Iraq, and those fuel convoys had to be protected, and they were constantly under attack. And that every day they'd have to gear up everybody in their Bradleys and all their equipment and fuel up to go protect the fuel convoy using more fuel at the same time. He said, it was not only a dangerous mission, but they used so much fuel protecting fuel convoys, they were basically a self-licking ice cream cone.
So the idea being to move away from a dependence on foreign oil.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things, this is actually how I got into this area. I was studying national security policy studies at OSU in the mid 1980s. And that was just as the US commitment to protect those oil fields in the Middle East was really beginning to escalate during the Iran-Iraq War. And that's really where I started thinking about this issue. It was only the climate impact I came on later, but Roger Stern at Princeton actually estimated that from 1976 to 2010, we spent something on the order of $8 trillion defending those oil fields. And I guarantee we probably spent $1 trillion since then. So there's a lot more to the price of oil than what we see on the sign at the gas station.
Absolutely. From your perspective, Fred, in teaching military personnel, how are we preparing them to face some of these issues or to address some of these issues?
Well, thanks. That's a great question. First of all, I'm going to start by taking off my Air Force badge.
Yes.
My Air Force badge. I've been told that I need to make sure you guys are aware that I'm speaking as effective of Fred Schauer, a personal opinion, and not a representative of the Department of the Air Force. So I wanted to make that clear. But the challenges of climate change and weather manifest themselves in several ways. One of which is the impact on our lands and our land uses. Congresswoman just eloquently mentioned that the devastating impact that it can have upon our bases. And the second one is, as Bob mentioned, impact upon fuel availability, which is a very critical resource for the military because fuel is how you move energy around and project power or deliver supplies, relief efforts, things like that. So in order to address these things, we need to both figure out how to make secure energy available all over the place, wherever it might be needed, and also make our systems resilient. And so there's a lot of advanced technology involved in addressing these two issues. And we like to think that our Department of Defense has access to the best available technology. How can we get that to the people who need it? And how can we train the people to provide the best technology and get it where it needs to be?
And I think that the idea of resilience is really important because as you know, it's sort of like we need to do two things at once. We need to address the issues that cause climate change, but we also need to be resilient in the interim in trying to recover. I mean, if we think of resilience as recovery and the ability to move on after some of these impacts. I don't know, Congresswoman, do you have, in terms of, you mentioned Naval Station Norfolk, which is, I think, the largest naval station in the world, perhaps. And how do you protect, how do you address that? I know we talked about infrastructure, but is it going to mean significant change?
Well, I think that, we have built over time, the Naval Station just, celebrated its 100th anniversary recently, and, is the largest naval station in the world. So, more than half of the Navy ships and half of our aircraft carriers operate out of the Naval Station. And, when we look at infrastructure issues and things that we build, and as we build for the future, things like our piers, even piers that were upgraded 10 or 15 years ago. I remember when I was a lieutenant, a department head on a destroyer, we had these old piers that were, basically wood pylons supporting, but with, concrete. And then, all of the services that a ship uses next to the pier when they're in port, run along those piers, and even upgrades that were made 10 or 15 years ago to make double-decker piers where the utilities run underneath the upper level of the pier at extremely high tides. Those things are underwater. And so, you then have to, cut that power to the ship to be safe and run the ship's own generators to support it next to the pier. And so we're looking at infrastructure investments that we made, just within the last decade that are, already being impacted. So, when we look at DoD, I think looking at standards, building standards for the future to make sure that, the future impacts of flooding are taken into account are very important. There's some very seemingly minor things that, are done by other government agencies, but, that impact that. NOAA, for example, also maps and tracks precipitation. If you look across the country, that precipitation data has not been collected and, funded routinely. And we have seen, shifts and changes in precipitation with added to higher sea levels, all should be taken into account in the investments that we make in DoD for these types of infrastructure changes. So, I think that as a legislator, making sure that, those types of things, all of the data essentially that goes into the decisions made in the future are very important. And so, here in the Hampton Roads area, there are very large infrastructure projects, things as big as, flood gates across the Elizabeth River, the Lafayette River, which are, in the local vicinity of the Naval Station. But also DoD is investing a lot in resiliency related projects. Living shorelines and less expensive type mitigation efforts actually do provide a great amount of, surge volume capacity when we do have weather events. And different projects, even with the Army Corps of Engineers for oyster restoration projects, which create basically, sort of artificial reefs in the rivers and help both, clean the water in the environment, but, also contribute to the living shoreline. So, I think that there's a whole host of things that DoD can do, thinking differently. And if you look at something such as the Naval Station, over a century, a lot of these federal facilities were actually landfilled, and we filled in, bodies of water, which, now have nowhere to go. And that is also exacerbated, with the rising sea level. So I think that, we really need to look at the combination of all of those effects and figure out the smart investments to protect our defense infrastructure and have it resilient and usable for the future. And resiliency, I would assume in other communities that have huge impacts of sea level rise and recurrent flooding is a very common term. A lot of these climate change type discussions, especially in the previous administration, unfortunately became a very partisan type thing. There was reporting that certain government agencies couldn't use the word climate change in their documents, which is unfortunate. I think DoD still clearly used sea level rise and recurrent flooding to describe the issues and work through their policy changes. But here in our coastal area in Virginia, it is a very nonpartisan issue. Every local government, regardless of party, every city council, county commission, has truly dedicated resources towards the future of our region relative to climate change and sea level rise. And even Norfolk, the city of Norfolk, has a chief resiliency officer. The Commonwealth of Virginia has appointed a retired admiral, Admiral Ann Phillips, as the resiliency officer. And really our General Assembly is trying to look very long term at the investments that need to be made not only for the defense related issues, but all of our communities. And then there's even a further discussion that has to do with disparity and kind of the investments made in different areas based off of the economic return to our communities of those areas, and making sure that we don't leave anyone behind, basically because of where they live or any other factors when we look at that, just really equity in dealing with these issues. And so very vulnerable neighborhoods and public housing areas and different things like that are very susceptible to flooding. So I think, beyond resiliency and national defense, it's also kind of something we need to look at as an equity issue within our communities to make sure we address all areas of the community.
Right, and that is so true. And actually, that was a major theme in the book that I mentioned, Elizabeth Rush's book on because the most vulnerable communities are often those with the least ability to influence what's happening around them, and also the least likely to want to move or to be mobile, to be, able to relocate easily. And you mentioned the partisanship, and I think Bob has given these presentations in some very conservative areas of Southern Ohio and West Virginia. And, when we talk about climate change, we've learned to tailor the message to the audience. And there are some people who will respond to issues of wildlife, polar bear, protection. There are some people who will respond more to the economic arguments or the health arguments, childhood asthma. But national security is one of those topics where a lot of conservatives can be brought into this conversation. And I know, Bob, you've experienced that national security really is something, and as the Congresswoman said, that goes sort of beyond party, hopefully.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. When I talk to conservative audiences down here, which is mostly who I end up talking to down here in Southern Ohio and West Virginia, when you talk about climate change as a national security issue, that is a way that you can reach those folks. I was actually a participant on a radio show in Huntington, West Virginia, with shall we say, a very, very conservative radio host. And I led with this and talked about the national security implications of climate change and all the things we're going to talk about. And it really is a way in to talk to people, where you can say, look, this is something that we have to do to protect America's position in the world and to protect the American population. And it is a way to talk to people and communicate
And
with
to protect personnel.
Yeah.
Do you, among your, Fred, among your students, do you see a lot of conversation about this? Do you see interest in this? Are they on the sort of on the front lines of knowing what's going on here?
Well, this issue can be partisan, and if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen and try to bring up a couple of things that hopefully shed some light into why we're so interested in these issues. If that's all right, I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. Oh no, it says host disabled participant screen share.
Marie, can you let him? I apologize.
Let me see if I can change that. Give me 1 second. While I look at that, you may want to go on to another question because it may take a second. So,
or if you want to talk and share.
Sure. So I was going to show a picture of some ports in the UK and Italy, and if you just look over,
I think I fixed it, Fred. I think I fixed it. So try again.
Oh, excellent.
Great.
Excellent.
We are all Zoom experts after this year, so.
Oh, very good. So I'm not exactly sure what you can see. Can you see my little smiley face at the bottom?
Yes.
Okay. All right, that's my test. So this is a plot of the sea level versus years and thousands of years. Or no, this is actually temperature here on this axis, and it shows. Oops. It shows the sea level has moved like a foot in a relatively short period of time. And if you look at the top of it, I can't tell if you can see the top, but this plot down here shows we're actually not at the peak sea level right now. If you just go back a mere 1,000 years or so, the sea level was about 35 feet taller. And so if you look at this enormous investment made in this fortified port in the UK, the water used to be surrounded by water. And so the port is gone, right? There's no water in the ocean's not near this anymore. So just imagine the level. This is like the equivalent of a huge base in modern times. This is a large castle made with manual labor, fortifying a port so that they can protect themselves from the Vikings. And so you think about the level of investment there. If you've got the resources, it's not hard to move your base and address these huge swings in sea level, which are you have events that you don't have any control over. And energy is a huge issue. And right, we've talked about the fuel convoys. This is just a quick look at the cost of energy, normal cost of energy variation across the world. And so it ranges anywhere from 18 cents a gallon right next to the refineries in Kuwait to 2 orders of magnitude more than that if you go elsewhere. And the reason this is such an issue for the DoD is we're the single largest user of energy in the world. And so that means we have the single largest bill for energy in the world. And if things go up 2 orders of magnitude, right, we can no longer afford to fly. And so this is a very recent example here showing the natural gas prices. Natural gas is about the cheapest and easiest, most convenient means to move energy around right now. A great way to store energy. This is the price of natural gas historically, and this peak you're seeing here is the peak from the events in Texas when things froze. And demand shot up, and availability went down, and it actually went off the chart. It went up to $400. So these are the 2 things that really get through. Right? If sea level changes this much and your base is underwater or above water and you can't float your ships out anymore, how are you going to deal with that? Do you have the resources to deal with that? And can you address things when the cost of your energy changes multiple orders of magnitude? Instead of billion-dollar fuel bills for the Department of the Air Force, we're looking at $20 billion or $200 billion fuel bills. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Hopefully I've addressed that question. Those 2 issues we have to think hard about how we're going to address those. And that's not a partisan problem.
And that goes back to, I know Congressman Luria talked about funding. I mean, even if you have everybody wanting to devote resources to these issues, to not be able to predict fuel, for instance, to not be able to predict what the cost will be is definitely a challenge.
Definitely, and DoD maintains a very large fuel reserve in order to ensure that they have adequate fuel available both in CONUS and at various points around the world. But as that fluctuates, that's a direct price tag that gets added to our defense budget as we see the prices of fuel go up and down over the course of years, or as you mentioned, Fred, a direct spike that was a result of a weather event in Texas.
Bob, I've heard you talk a couple of times on these issues. And one of the things that I think is most interesting is the issue of international instability and how that really leaves us more vulnerable, or gives, everyone in the world sort of has to change how their diplomatic and military strategies fit with this kind of climate instability or regime instability caused by climate change.
Yeah, when you look at a warming world, and the Paris goal is to hold it to a 2 degrees Celsius increase, 1.5 if possible. But if the world starts to warm beyond 1.5, even between 1.5 and 2 degrees, you're going to start to get some very serious effects. More intense heat waves, obviously, but you're also going to see, and I think beyond rising sea levels, which we've talked about in a country like Bangladesh, where 17% of Bangladesh is vulnerable to sea level rise by 2050, you could create somewhere between 18 and 20 million migrants, climate migrants. And when you look at increased forest fires, when you look at heat waves, when you look at, most intensely for me, I think the most important effect of this is going to be increased drought, loss of access to water. All this means it's going to be harder and harder to feed a world of 9 or 10 billion people by the middle of this century. There's an estimate from a study that was in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences just a few months ago that said about 1% of the Earth's surface is uninhabitable right now. By 2070, without significant change, it could be 19%. And what you're going to see are these huge migration flows, huge numbers of immigrants. You could have 1 billion climate migrants by the end of the 21st century. And we've seen that can create tremendous amounts of instability. And one example, I think the best example, perhaps a warning of things to come, is Syria. The civil war in Syria began because of the Arab Spring, but it also came at the end of almost a decade of drought in the Eastern Mediterranean, the worst drought in about 900 years. And that drought turned about 60% of Syria's land into desert, killed about 80% of their cattle, and drove about 1.5 million migrants into Syria's city, where that government, which was not a particularly efficient government, was just unable to deal with a climate catastrophe on that scale. And it happened just as the Arab Spring was lighting a match to the politics in that region. And so the Syrian civil war might be the first great geopolitical event that has, at least as an important component, climate change mixed in. Climate change is at least a partial driver of that event. And we saw that the immigrants that streamed, the migrants that streamed out of Syria into Europe, then destabilized European politics. That as they streamed into Eastern and Central Europe, you see the rise in these very far right nationalist parties. Viktor Orban and the Fidesz party in Hungary, and the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and all across the National Front in France, and the Alternative for Germany party in Germany, all began to use this migrant crisis as fuel to power their rise. And it destabilized politics there. It played a huge role in the Brexit vote. Mm-hmm. The most popular poster, that billboard that was all over the UK during the Brexit vote, showed streams of Middle Eastern migrants coming into the UK. And it helped drive the Brexit vote, which has roiled European politics. It's affected our relationship with NATO. So these can have really important consequences as we start to see all these migrants flow from these climate catastrophes. And a country like Pakistan or Bangladesh could see multiple climate catastrophes simultaneously.
Yeah, and migration is definitely, I know someone on the, someone in our audience actually put a question on migration in the chat as well. So I know it's on people's minds. And of course, during the previous administration, there was, we severely cut back on the number of refugees we were to accept. But for Congresswoman Luria, how do you see, what kinds of policies do we need as a country to address the possibility of climate migrants, refugees?
Well, quite a broad question. I
know. Sorry.
Been a strong advocate, of comprehensive immigration reform, and it was very distressing in the previous administration to see how refugees were treated. I think we all look at the Statue of Liberty and kind of understand the founding principles of our country, being the welcoming shores that allow people to come here, and you have to add in there legally. But yes, we need to make that pathway more possible for people who like Bob said, or in various parts of the world are continuing to be impacted by war, economic crisis, and climate crisis now. And so I think that yes, that will continue to be a factor in migration around the world, and it's part of a much larger discussion. I think that we definitely need to make significant changes to our immigration policies to welcome people here who are going to contribute to our country and our
yeah, and just the idea that as with the folks we said in the United States who don't necessarily want to leave their homes that are being impacted, folks around the world don't want to do that either. So it all goes back to addressing climate change and trying to maintain the stability that comes with not having these severe droughts or severe flooding or whatever the other impacts may be. Climate change has also opened up a sort of new area of competition, as it were. We've been reading a lot about the Arctic Circle and the fact that this may be a new, with the melting, with the availability, with being access to the Arctic Circle, perhaps year round. How is this going to change our relationships with some of our competitors, as we might think of China, Russia, others? Yes, you can start. I'm sorry. Representative Luria, you can start.
Sure. No, I mean, this is definitely something of grave concern that we discuss frequently in the Armed Services Committee. We actually made the first investment in a very long time, and some new ships, polar icebreakers. I think it's very important that the U.S. Maintains the ability to allow safe passage in the Arctic. We've had a carrier strike group, the Harry S. Truman, recently operate above the Arctic Circle, and I think you'll see that more frequently for our ships and aircraft, because there are particular conditions unique to operating in such cold weather, and making sure that our sailors and ships are trained to operate in that environment. We've seen increased Russian activity in the North Atlantic with their submarines, and I think that really making sure that we have the appropriate focus in that area of the world, the appropriate ability to operate there is very important. And I think that both militarily and diplomatically, there's a lot of challenges that are going to be faced by increased access to the Arctic, which is obviously exacerbated by climate change and the ability to navigate there year round when that was not possible before. So, I could probably go off on quite a long tangent about the Navy force composition and our number of submarines, but obviously we do have the capability to operate in those regions, and it's important that we maintain a fleet that can continue to do that and maintain an advantage over any of our potential adversaries in that environment and others.
Thank you. Bob or Fred, do you have any thoughts on the Arctic issues, the competition?
Yeah, that's becoming an open ocean. Admiral David Titley was the chief oceanographer of the United States Navy for a long time, has estimated that by about the middle of the next decade, by 2035 or so, the Arctic will be completely an open ocean for big chunks of the year. I mean, you've got huge shipping routes opening up. Just a couple weeks ago in February, a Russian natural gas tanker was able to transit, they call the Northern Sea Route, from the Pacific to the Atlantic in February. Reykjavik sees itself as the Singapore of the 21st century as you start to open that up. And so you're going to have sea routes there, and they're going to require protection. As the Congresswoman said, it's going to open up this arena for competition in the Arctic. Also, if the world remains addicted to fossil fuels, there are tremendous oil and gas reserves in the floor of the Arctic. On that presentation, I've actually got a little picture of a Russian submarine planting a Russian flag underneath the North Pole in 2009, I believe it was. So that's a place where you could see increased competition for a whole variety of reasons in the 21st century.
Fred, I don't want to leave you out of this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the Air Force, of course, issues we're talking about are largely Navy dominated, although if you want to go into the Arctic in and out quickly, then Air Force technology is a key. But one of the things that we haven't mentioned is the Coast Guard, right? And the Coast Guard largely maintains our large icebreakers. And if you want to do shipping in places that have thin ice now that you couldn't previously, and certainly there's reason to believe it's going to become a real economically competitive resource, these unique sea lanes that are available. Then you look at the investment that's been made in large icebreakers that can keep these shipping lanes open. And there's some significant disparities, right? So how do you address those? You either address them with investment or technology or a combination of both. But if you're strained for resources, you've got to pick and choose which ones are going to be the winners.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm going to go to an audience question, actually. And it is, are we prepared to quickly adapt to potential diseases that might arise from climate change? Now, this isn't exactly necessarily national security, and yet it is. because as we have seen, a pandemic can have a tremendous effect on the world. So I would put that out there because one of our visitors had asked it, and I don't know which one of you would like to speak to that. There's
Sure. Well, I'm happy to kick off this discussion. I mean, I think that, you know, we are 1 year in now to the effects of COVID. You know, it was 1 year ago yesterday that the first case was identified here in Virginia, and you know, we saw this rapidly spread, and we've now lost 500,000, more than 500,000 Americans alone to this pandemic. And I think that, you know, looking back, we can acknowledge that there are a lot of things that we had not done to be well prepared for a pandemic. You know, things from early on with the PPE, the ability to do testing. Now, you know, the vaccine is getting out, but, you know, an efficient method and system by which to distribute the vaccine. And so, you know, I think that we would be remiss to not take lessons learned from this, you know, event that we've had with COVID and make sure that we're well prepared in the future. A strategic stockpile of a lot of the equipment and PPE that we would need. You know, the military does have, you know, operational plans and contingencies for dealing with the pandemic, but how well were they trained in that? How much were they used? The VA, for example, their fourth mission is, you know, public health in the time of an emergency. With the already strained resources they have, are we able to leverage any of that? And like, what kind of investments in additional capacity could we build in the future there to be able to respond better in these type of situations? And then we've also determined, you know, that in our medical supply chain, there's a huge reliance on, you know, technology and goods and components imported from places such as China. So what do we need to do to rebuild the domestic capacity for producing those types of things in order to respond to a pandemic or any other type of medical emergency or disease that could spread in the future? So I think the answer is, you know, yes, I think these things can either be caused or exacerbated by climate change, and we really need to look at all of the things that we need to do to put an infrastructure in place to respond better. I think not if, but when something like this happens again in the future.
I agree. Bob or Fred?
Yeah, it's not just novel diseases like the coronavirus, it's the spread of tropical diseases into areas where they normally didn't exist because the cold winters used to kill them off. So you're starting to see dengue fever and Zika and viruses of all kinds, diseases of all kinds that used to be limited to the tropics now starting to spread. Tick-borne diseases, all kinds of things spreading in places. And that's something that countries like the United States, like Canada and others are going to have to deal with.
Absolutely. Fred, are you trying to unmute? Because I see you looking at your screen. There we go.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my phone started ringing. So I think, yeah, as the weather pattern shifts, right, you see changes in risks that are out there, and as we become more connected in the world, certainly the risk of transmission and breakouts arise. You know, the DoD actually does a pretty good job of managing a very large healthcare system, and there are numerous issues with it. But you know, I can say that you know, I've seen a lot of vets vaccinated in the Dayton area here, thanks in large part because we've got the largest air base in the world and a great medical team and great medical training here. And so those kind of resources can be used, but you also have to have the investment that's required to address these things. And the competition for resources, supply chain, how do you secure your supply chain supplies of both medicine and, of course, energy, and being able to live with the consequences from the climate changing.
Absolutely. I want to mention that one of our audience members has put a number of really good comments and also links. Jeff DeBalco, who is a professor at Ohio University. So for those of you who might be interested in following some of the links that he has added to the conversation. Also Bob Steinbeck from Citizens Climate Lobby. So we have some folks on the call who work in these areas as well. One of the questions that came in earlier was about the shift in strength between countries that are embracing renewable energy and becoming more self-sufficient in terms of energy generation and less dependent on other countries' resources. How is that going to end up? I mean, again, I'm asking these incredibly general questions to all of you, but how do you see that impacting the relative strength of countries going forward? Bob, do you want to start with that?
Well, one of the obvious things is related to something I talked about earlier. The United States military has been required since really the late 1970s, since the Carter administration, to spend an enormous amount of resources protecting the oil fields of the Middle East, the Persian Gulf region, all the way back to 1979, when you had the multiple crises in 1979, the invasion of Afghanistan and the near revolution in Saudi Arabia, the overthrow of the Shah in Iran. We became very much interested in protecting those oil fields. And we have had a whole string of very large commitments to the Middle East since then. And as long as the United States remains committed to devoting huge resources to defending those oil fields, it makes it more difficult to fund other priorities because if you're funding, it's like opportunity cost. If you're spending all your money doing that, then trying to meet the challenge of a rising China becomes more difficult. I actually saw a quote from an unattributed Chinese diplomat said if the United States could do anything to speed China's rise, what would it be? And said, well, you could get involved in another war in the Middle East. That would help.
And, I remember in what year was it? I actually had it written down somewhere. The Great Green Fleet. The Secretary of the Navy was talking about biofuels. And it was more expensive than regular fuel, but there were significant benefits. And it was coupled with energy efficiency and other kinds of approaches. And I guess one question, and there was a question in the chat as well, about the Air Force looking at alternative fuels. And Fred might know about that, and Congresswoman about alternative fuels for naval vessels. Are we looking a lot into those things? I'll start with Congresswoman.
Well, yes, I think that we remember Secretary Mavis's initiative
Yes.
when I think there was a lot of prospect for biofuels to become a large part potentially of the fuel that was available, and to be able to use less petroleum-based products, but other other products from animal fat to grape seeds to corn and grains and different things. And the Navy did do several sort of test demonstrations using these fuels, which were a combination of petroleum and biofuel that could be replaced interchangeably with the other fuels that the Navy was using. And I think that the thing that kind of drove this plan into the ground was the increased cost of the biofuels, and the fact that the amount of fuel and the 1.4 billion gallons of fuel, my number might be wrong, but the incredibly small percentage of the demand that DoD would have versus what was produced in the US of biofuel, and the additional cost to purchase it versus combined with the unavailability of it, never allowed this to materialize as a long-term alternative, for military ships to use that type of fuel. The International Maritime Organization, for example, has shifted the type of fuel, the bulk fuel that's allowed to be used on commercial vessels, and that actually just went into effect last year. So within a certain distance of the coast of any country, the commercial vessels are not allowed to use a certain type of very unrefined polluting fuel, and must use more refined fuel. So those types of things are in effect for cutting CO2 emissions within the commercial fleet. Within the Navy, there's obviously our nuclear powered aircraft carriers and submarines as an alternative. But the use of nuclear power in submarines and aircraft carriers, really is for operational purposes for their endurance. But aircraft carriers obviously still use jet fuel for the aircraft on board and require those petroleum products. And a wider use of nuclear powered vessels, I think, is demonstrated over time when we did have other nuclear powered ships that, the cost of that type of technology and the training and of the personnel and the maintenance really exceeded the benefit of that type of propulsion on our ships. What I'd say DoD has done a considerable amount in, and I would say is leading in the area of trying to use renewable energies for the installations. I think pretty much around here, anywhere you drive, there is some degree of renewable energy being used on the bases, and also the power that DoD purchases, a certain percentage of it is mandated to be from renewable sources. And so I think that there is an increased area there. DoD has incentivized efficiency programs, as far as the efficiency of insulation in buildings, the type of light bulbs that are used. I mean, like on every Navy building and every ship in the fleet has been replaced over a course of years with LED bulbs. And the way in which we operate, those types of things, really a lot of considerations have been taken into account to try to be energy saving. But as far as the fleet goes and different ideas, people, why can't a ship just be solar powered? Well, a ship has very important requirements for size, weight, stealth. So large solar panels could produce some energy there, but in order for them to operate in the way which they must operate at sea, I think just would physically be not an alternative that would be viable for military vessels at a minimum. So but I think that DoD also wants to lead in research and development of different types of things that can assist with renewable energy. Something that I was a proponent of in the last Congress, I introduced the House version of the bill. In the Senate, Senator Murkowski had introduced the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act. I think that there is a huge potential for advanced nuclear and new types of nuclear fuel. I'm not talking about going back and building 1960s era pressurized water reactors, but smaller modular reactors. And to get to some of the points that Bob and Fred made about the vulnerability of our forces overseas and delivering energy options to them forward, takes energy in of itself and puts our troops in a vulnerable situation. So the use of small modular reactors for defense purposes, that development I think is important. The Senate passed this as part of the defense bill last year. The House passed it as part of an energy package. And although the full legislation as an entity didn't pass, actually the important part, the funding for several prototype reactors was included in the previous two bills, the previous 2 years appropriations packages. So the idea that as a federal government we are investing in advanced nuclear, which I think can add to the more commonly talked about things such as wind and solar, is very important as well.
Yeah, and I do also, it's interesting because there's always trade-offs. I remember in the conversation about the biofuels, there were environmentalists who felt that the land use that was being dedicated to producing those fuels was not a good choice. So we always have to balance so many issues that relate to this, including land use, including obviously cost. And I know one question that came up would in the chat function was if, as the public sector, as the public in this country changes more to renewable fuels and away from fossil fuels, will that help the military in the sense that it will free up some fossil fuel to be devoted to military uses? Because we see more and more throughout the country that there are wind farms and solar farms, and the use of geothermal and large scale utility scale. So is that gonna sort of offset and help the military in terms of their needs for fossil fuels?
Well, I think that, certain things like ships and aircraft, because of how they operate and where they operate and the ability to, respond quickly, go at high speeds, and all of the other operational characteristics of them. I don't see an immediate replacement for fossil fuels in those areas, but I think that there are, like I said, other ways that DoD can leverage the use of, renewable energy to cut their overall use of fossil fuels. Here in Virginia, for example, we are doing the first offshore wind project in federal waters. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has set aside 144,000 acres off the coast of Virginia. There's actually about 14 projects currently either underway or being planned off the East Coast, and this is the largest in federal waters. It's a major utility project. Dominion Energy is doing this, but the point will be that the amount of over 4,000 megawatts that this is going to produce for the Mid-Atlantic region, Virginia, the military's use, the more of those projects that are there, the overall demand for fossil fuels, across the region and the country will continue to go down. So, I think the things we can do to incentivize investments in greener, cleaner energy are very important. During the last administration, it was a battle just to try to stop offshore drilling off the coast. So, I obviously don't want to incentivize, further exploration for fossil fuels, and would rather put that investment into, the greener, cleaner infrastructure such as offshore wind.
Very good. Fred or Bob, did you have anything on that one?
Sure, I'll just comment that about 80% of our energy right now comes from fossil fuels, whether it's natural gas, coal, of course, diminishing, but or oil, and not a huge percent is used for air travel and powering ships, right? It's on the order of 10 or 20%. So a lot of it is used actually for environmental controls, making warm air, which is not a real efficient use of fossil fuels. And if you could offset the massive amounts of energy that are being used for stationary applications that are amenable to renewable energy, then you could hopefully change the economics and the availability of fossil fuels. Right? Instead of needing 80% of our energy from fossil fuels, we only need 10 or 20% from fossil fuels, and we got the remainder from renewable resources. It'd be fantastic. There's a lot of interest in using bio and alternative fuels in these kinds of systems, but people have, when it comes to looking at the scale of these systems, you don't realize until you look at that scale just how many resources we would have to apply to address this need through bio and alternative fuels. So I don't know if I can still share my screen.
You should be able to.
Oh yeah, looks like it. So this is a really neat MIT. DoD works a lot with Lincoln Labs at MIT. This is a neat MIT study on how much land would have to be applied or set aside to address just our jet fuel needs. And so this big circle right here, is how much land we would need to offset just our jet fuel use, not counting the Navy ships, but just all our jet transportation, jet fuel needs. And this is using the current crops that are growing in our environment. And I don't think anybody wants to dedicate that amount of land to bio and alternative fuels. We'd much rather have food from that land. That's assuming we find that much land to be arable. So instead of looking at 90% of the, or addressing a small percent of the problem and using a lot of resources to do that, the question becomes, can you address the other 75% of the energy problem? I think solve that part of it. It's probably a lot more doable with current energy trends, and enable the remaining fossil fuels for the systems where we really need that energy density and the economics to pay off.
Right. I think that's actually what the questioner had in mind, that if you could, your land bases could operate with less fossil fuel, then that would allow for more for those uses that are not easily substituted. We are at about, we're about an hour into this. I'd like to give each of our guests, and we have covered, I think, most of the questions in the chat function, but I'd like to give each of our guests a chance for some closing remarks. Fred, would you like to start?
Well, Well, a lot of a lot of how the country reacts to this is going to have to do with the investments we make and the costs associated with them. And it's really exciting to see that the cost of solar and wind power are now becoming competitive with natural gas and advanced nuclear technologies are similar economics. So there's a lot of exciting technologies that are out there. The other thing that's really exciting to me anyway is how technologies are enabling us to do missions with less energy. For instance, we didn't all drive to this meeting, right? We use hardly energy at all to power up our laptops and our iPads. Similarly, it used to be that a combat air patrol, the cheapest way to do a combat air patrol was an F-16 fighter, and that thing gobbles up about 600 gallons per hour. So that's a lot of energy. In the recent use of UAVs, the MQ-1B took that number of 600 gallons per hour as our cheapest combat air patrol and took it all the way down to 4 gallons per hour. And you look at some of these systems that are starting to replace the Predator. As we miniaturize electronics and get more precise in delivering payloads and things like that, we can really make revolutionary changes in the costs of doing sustainable air power, sustainable naval presence, things like that. But if you really need to move a whole bunch of stuff with the C-17 or a 777, there's no getting around the energy costs involved. And so how can we utilize our our innovative history here in the United States and continue that tradition to address some of these needs and make it win-win for everybody?
Thank you. Very good. Bob.
I always try to end these things on a positive note. In the past, America and the world's addiction to fossil fuels had a whole bunch of really negative side effects. It funds Russia's across the board military buildup in the Iranian nuclear program, and terrorist groups around the world like ISIS and Al Qaeda get their money ultimately from oil money, and it funds negative governments around the world like the Maduro government in Venezuela. And that's why what Fred just talked about with the pace of technological change right now, we are really at a tipping point. I think we are moving with the new administration and the investment I think we're about to make in renewable technology, which I'm very excited about. I think we are moving into a new era where we can, when you look at the cost of solar generated electricity and wind powered electricity, and Jane's heard me say this several times, oil and gas and coal are commodities, and their price rises and falls with supply and demand and disruptions in the marketplace. Wars in the Middle East drives the price up. Renewable energy is a technology. Technological prices go down. As this technology develops, the most expensive price for solar power is today. Tomorrow it'll be cheaper, and the next day it'll be cheaper. And I think we're about to move into a new era. And I do think it'll have, when we make this adjustment, really positive effects on American national security and on just the way we power our civilization. So I think things are really starting to look up. For a while there, I was a little worried, but I think we're on the verge of a real revolution.
Thank you. And I love the distinction between a commodity and a technology. And I remember the first time you said that, it made so much sense. And the different effects that the market has on commodities versus technologies. So thank you, Bob. Congresswoman Luria, would you like to say a few closing remarks?
Oh, well, thank you again, Jane, for having me today. And Bob and Fred, it was good to meet you virtually and join in this conversation. And I want to thank everybody who took time to listen in. And I think that means that you're very passionate and also concerned about these very important issues, as are we. And I think Bob's description of the negative impacts geopolitically of the reliance on fossil fuels is very accurate. And I think that as we move to less dependence on fossil fuels, more ability to improve our technology for wind, solar, nuclear, geothermal, something we may not be, other technologies we may not even be aware of yet today, but those where we can draw our energy from other sources that do not have that reliance on fossil fuels or the negative impact to our environment from the use of fossil fuels. I think that's the direction that we need to go. And, as a legislator, those are the types of policies that I, am looking for and looking forward to promoting in this Congress and under this administration.
Well, I appreciate it, and keep us all, we will keep in touch through your staff, so we know all the various kinds of things that are being discussed and how we can help support those initiatives, because we do have a very strong environmental and climate ethic among many groups in Ohio, and it is just growing really every day. So thank you. We would love to support that. And I want to thank everyone who signed in and listened and added comments and questions. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to, are looking forward to hearing the next ones, I encourage you to become a member or donate to Green Energy Ohio through our website at greenenergyohio.org. There are times when I've forgotten to say that, and my staff always says, ask for them to join. So yes, we would love to have you as members, as supporters, and together we will be able to make a real change on issues that are important to all of us. Thank you again.